Hi, I'm Jonathan Weiss, and this is our Dumbo, Brooklyn, New York showroom for OMA and Fleetwood Sound. Today I'm going to be talking about monitors, meaning studio monitor speakers, the history of them, why they're so important, something about their function, and then, we're going to end up talking about big picture things in sound because the monitor is sort of a linchpin for so many very interesting things. And in sound and music and audio, meaning reproduced sound, what I see is people atomized and talking about one very narrow aspect of sound reproduction, and then they miss the larger picture, which is why sound sounds so bad today. And that's really why I'm here, because with our companies, OMA and Fleetwood Sound, we are trying to change that. And the speaker behind me is the new old OMA monitor speaker. And I say new old because it's gotten a reissue. It's taken about 2 years, but as new components became available, we realized that we could dramatically improve the performance of this speaker. And there's going to be videos that you can see separate, which are just about this speaker as a product. So this is not the point of this video. This is a very, very efficient two-way speaker with a 12-inch high efficiency neodymium woofer, professional of course, and a professional AMT, which is an air motion transformer. It's a high-powered version of a folded ribbon. Again, it's used in pro only. This is not home audio stuff. These are very high efficiency drivers. They're in a quite substantial enclosure. The details about the enclosure, you can see on the other video, which is about this as a product. Why this is interesting, well, it's an interesting story how it came into be. Because if you look around at the rest of the things we make, it doesn't look like them. And of course, the majority of the speakers we make, which have large expressed horns, that would never work for a studio monitor. But it's more interesting to start this with why did we make a monitor in the first place? Why would we make something like this? And it's an interesting story. We'll put in a picture here of a speaker that myself and my partner Cynthia affectionately called the Cobbler, which was short for the cobbler's children have no shoes. In the kitchen dining area of this studio, loft in Dumbo, where we're often preparing food or entertaining, there was no speaker. And Cynthia said, well, the cobbler's children have no shoes. Why can't we have a speaker in here? And I'm like, I don't want to have our stuff in here. So Bill Woods, my mentor, the person who designed all of our speakers for the first 15 years, is responsible for the conical profile, one of the world's great horn and loudspeaker designers. He always said, Jonathan, you really need to know what the important speakers in the history of audio sound like so that you can make products that are at least that good, if not better. This was very sage advice. And there were two drivers that Bill really liked very much. One was a 12-inch paper cone, white cone, very cool looking woofer made by JBL in the 70s, studio monitors. And another one was this strange driver called an AMT, air motion transformer, which was invented by Professor Oscar Heil, I believe in the 60s. And these folded ribbons had incredibly low distortion, and thus they were efficient. They were very lifelike. And Bill said, you should have those. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do with them? We don't, they don't exist. They never existed in a design. He said, well, I'll make you something, and then Cynthia will be happy because you'll have a great speaker in the kitchen. And we made this. You see the picture. Super cool. But those drivers, they ceased existing 50 years ago. So there was no way to make a speaker like that today. Nonetheless, people would come in and say, you know, that's a speaker I would really like. And then talking with Bill, I said, you know, that would make an extremely good studio monitor if you ever wanted to do such things. And as time went on with OMA and Fleetwood Sound, well, OMA, because it's before Fleetwood Sound, I started to meet more and more studio people, professionals, mastering engineers, mixing engineers, recording engineers, and the subject of monitors would come up. Now, I want to cut here to my own history and the past, and talk a little bit also about what a monitor is and what it was. So if you're in a studio, whether that's a recording studio or a Foley studio for film, you know, you have to have, you're hearing what the microphones are bringing in through the amplification, and there has to be a speaker for the engineer to know what's happening and what to do with the sound. And it should be pretty obvious that it has to be an extremely good speaker. And that means that it really honestly tells you what's happening with the recording chain and with the artists. So it has to have very good amplitude domain response, and that's the frequency. And then it also has to have what unfortunately in audio has been thrown under the bus. It has to have extremely good time domain response. And that simply means that as a musical event unfolds in time, for example, a drum strike, that signal is reproduced in time correctly, and it doesn't continue, for example. That's very bad. And unfortunately, that's a big problem in all of audio today, both on the home side and the professional side. So the original monitors, which were made by companies like Western Electric in the United States in the beginning, Klangfilm, RCA, and then after the war, RCA in England, Tannoy, for example, and Altec with the 604. These monitor speakers were large. They were considered to be, they were very expensive, and they were actually considered to be too expensive for almost anyone to have in their home. They used a 15-inch woofer, and then inside of that, in the center, a compression driver and a horn. The horn could be the paper cone on the Tannoy, or it could be a little multi-cell, very cool-looking thing on an Altec 604, and on the RCA LC1 dual concentric, there was not a horn. There were these cool little deflectors at which worked a bit like a horn. These speakers were extremely accurate, honest, lifelike, and for the most part, really great sounding, which is why today all three of them are still sought after and in demand. Some of them, because of the collectability, et cetera, have become extremely expensive, relatively speaking. There actually is no vintage audio really that's extremely expensive compared to things like art, cars, wristwatches, or other collectibles. So these monitors, which really were part and parcel of the sound of the golden age of recording, which I would say is from the 1950s through into the 70s. These monitors were absolutely integral to the sound on the records, because the monitor, in essence, imprints its own sonic aspects, its sound, its attributes, onto what is mastered and made through it. Now, I want you to try and understand this. This is very important. That the monitor is the lens, since we are a little too dominant in terms of sight versus sound, so I have to go to a visual metaphor. The optics of that lens, or the television screen, probably better, right? Metaphor. That television screen, if it's got distortion, other crazy things happening in it, you wouldn't be able to properly, for example, create the color for what a show is supposed to look like, or a movie. So let's transpose this to sound. This monitor speaker is extremely important to the outcome of the sound, the record, or whatever, piece of music, however it's going to be heard via vinyl or today streamed. What that piece of music sounds like is going to be in direct relationship to the monitor. Okay, these speakers. It became apparent a number of years ago with these new drivers, especially the AMT, that we could make a version of the cobbler speaker, which was a one-off, and have something that could be used as a monitor. And I thought that would be actually a super cool thing to do, because it would get us into the production of music, not just the reproduction of music. In fact, we did sell a number of them, and I know that at least one pair is still in use by a very well-regarded and successful producer, Dolphus, who works with the Avett Brothers, for example. But we found that the monitor for pro studio applications, that was a non-starter. Now, we engineered these things to be the best mid-field monitor, meaning something that, a near-field monitor which goes onto the mixing board, the bridge of the mixing board of the console, really has to be about like this big. This is like NS10 size, right? So that these are not for that. They have to be in the midfield or in the far field, and also size-wise. I'm not going to go into the exact nature of how all of that works. It's just that when something's this big, it can't be right in front of you in a studio. So we made this thing to be the best possible midfield monitor for studio applications, but it did not catch on. And I found out something very, very interesting about why it didn't catch on, and that has to do with how studio guys, because I only have ever met studio guys, and how they work, and how they choose their monitors. And it's not how you might think. So, if we talk about musicians, a violinist is going to want to play the best sounding violin that they can possibly get their hands on. And the best violins are considered to be from the school of Cremona, like Stradivarius's, and they're obviously extremely expensive, up into the many millions of dollars. So, you think that since a musician would, want to choose the best sounding thing to work with, that somebody working all day, every day in studios, making music, recording sound and making music out of it, that they'd want to have the best sounding thing, right? Wrong. Engineers are just like high-end audiophiles. They want what other people that they respect or want to be like have. So they look at this studio or that engineer, and whatever they have, that's what they get. Today it seems to be the top end ATC. Over the years, it's been all sorts of things, Westlake, Genelec, etc. So I gave up on that whole thing, but what I wanted was to give somebody the amazing lifelike sound of those earlier monitors, which were accurate both in the time domain and the frequency or amplitude domain. And this is definitely that speaker. So this is super accurate, and it also sounds amazing. And here's where we get into the really interesting part of this whole discussion of monitors and what they do and how that affects music and sound. Because there's a lot of misunderstandings, and I often deal with people who are lay people, and when something like this speaker comes up, they say, well, I've heard that you want to make music using a very poor quality monitor because people don't have these amazing, accurate, lifelike speakers like you make. And that would make sense if poor quality speakers were all the same, and if you could mix music or make music using poor quality, monitoring, and still make something that sounds great on other speakers. The fact is, you can't, because bad speakers are all bad in different ways. And so if you correct for one bad speaker application, you end up, it's whack-a-mole, you end up moving the problem to someplace else. In fact, the problem that we have with monitor speakers today is that they have grown into their current form, which is, generally speaking, a relatively small powered box with a shit ton of DSP, which is digital signal processing. And the reason that's happened is because the driving force behind the design of such things has been flat frequency response. Flat frequency response is actually only one very small aspect of designing a speaker and designing an accurate, truthful, and good sounding speaker. There's other things that are quite more important. And in fact, to deal with the amplitude domain and frequency response directly, the idea that you want an absolutely flat response is absolutely incorrect. It's incorrect for a lot of reasons, but the main one is that through psychoacoustics, which is the study of how the human ears and brain actually take sound in and work with it, we find that we are not two microphones connected to a computer inside. We're a brain and a body. And how we hear looks like this, does not look like this. And also how measurements of, for example, frequency response on axis, semi-anechoically, those simply don't tell you what you need to know. For example, you would also need to know what is the off-axis response. Unfortunately, every time that you see frequency response shown in the literature, for marketing a product, a speaker product, you can guarantee a few things. And this is why we don't publish them. First is they're all faked. Not that they're fake like somebody just drew them, but they take the frequency response of their speaker, they measure it in a certain way, and then they run it through all sorts of smoothing and other ways to compress or elongate the thing to make it look as flat as possible. But now You hardly even have to do that kind of manipulation, because with DSP, digital signal processing, you type in what you want, and the digital stuff flattens out the response and gives you, this perfect flat line, which is also what you don't want to have. And so from a marketing standpoint, you just won. The problem is that digital signal processing has a cost, and usually that cost is really large. For example, to get that, you have to pay somewhere. Where you pay is distortion. Where you pay is things called latency and pre-ringing, which for laymen, the only thing you need to know is that what you actually hear out of these speakers is harsh, metallic, fatiguing, unpleasant, but it's super accurate. So now we're getting to an interesting place, right? With our technology, in a small box, we've gotten frequency response that you can't get unless you totally fuck with the thing digitally. And we get all the things we think we want, left brain head, measurement, isolated from everything else, right? And we've really thrown the baby out with the bathwater, because this is a thing that it isn't even accurate. It isn't accurate because it doesn't sound like real music. If you put real music through it, get to that in a moment, because these things are perfect for the kind of music we have today. But that, we're going to get there. So now we have this speaker, which has really good frequency response characteristics, which is great for the marketing department, because we've trained people, the consumers, whether they're pro consumers or home consumers, that we have to look for this, and the flattest one is the best. This is completely bullshit, because you have to look at things like distortion, off-axis response. You have to look at pattern formation, directivity, the uniformity of pattern, wavefront uniformity. All of these things are what dictate what a speaker, a monitor speaker especially, will actually sound like in a space. Now, most studios are very dead spaces, so you don't have so much of an issue with reverberation. But there is a problem which has to do with the fact that these new breed, which is for the last 10 or 20 years, this new breed of monitors is telling people who make music either a distorted truth or a partial truth. Now, about when this new reissue was, we had it scheduling. I saw a copy of Stereophile next to my desk at the factory, because the magazines just keep sending us copies. We don't subscribe, and maybe after this video they're not going to do that anymore, especially not Stereophile. But out of kind of perverse curiosity, because I don't read the magazines, I flipped it open. And lo and behold, it's a piece of karma, right? I look at the letters to the editor, and I'm going to share with you, bear with me, this letter, which was absolutely spot on the money and perfect. So somebody writes in the interview by Roger Dunn, Echo Grimm of Grimm Audio said, quote, "On the other hand, the average professional audio system won't move you emotionally. My dream with Grimm Audio was to develop equipment that would sound both neutral and emotionally involving." Grimm is in Holland, and they actually make quite cool monitors. Good company. This person continues, if a professional system relying on small monitor speakers is deficient in emotional involvement, I found myself wondering why. Does emotional involvement require other properties of the speaker and speaker setup from those of a quote-unquote professional speaker? For example, do certain types of distortion increase involvement? Question. Okay. Now, before I get to the answer from the editor-in-chief of Stereophile, I just want to emphasize that this person, it's hard to believe that they're writing in a Stereophile. He's talking about emotional involvement, because most audiophiles, they absolutely do not want emotional involvement with their equipment. You may think that I'm crazy. I'm not crazy. I've been talking about this. I'm going to talk about it more. No, they want to analyze the sound just like the critics in the magazines. They want to dissect their speaker sound, their equipment, their system's sound. They want to dissect it into little bits which they can move around like chess pieces and control this whole thing. They're not into emotional involvement. We make speakers that if they are not emotionally involving, I don't want to make them. Okay, back to the response. Mr. Groves, it's an interesting question. Regrettably, at this point in my development as an audiophile and audio writer, I don't know the answer. Okay, pause. This is Jim Austin. He's the editor-in-chief of Stereophile, which is one of the two biggest audio magazines for hi-fi, high-end audio in the whole world. And this guy, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, he was a scientist, he was a physicist. So he's the editor-in-chief of one of the two biggest hi-fi magazines, speaker magazines in the entire world, and he's a scientist. I don't know the answer. Huh? I do, however, feel well qualified to speculate. Designing a good pair of pro speakers is relatively straightforward. They need only be revealing of flaws, not virtues, in the mix. For that, all you need is a flat frequency response, parentheses, which is easily achieved, with perhaps a top end that is slightly tipped up so as to expose flaws in the most sensitive area and encourage caution in that range. Add to that, distortion must be low enough that it doesn't mask flaws inherent in the recording. That's also fairly easy to arrange. Emotional involvement is much harder. It requires, in addition to the absence of faults, many intangible aspects of the sound. Consider, for example, Thomas Lund's work on auditory involvement. Despite the claims of certain reductive hi-fi critics, mysteries still exist. And there's far more to it than we can easily measure. All right, so we just had the top dog at Stereophile magazine, who's a scientist, say, I'm clueless. I don't know why the involvement part is hard. And here's penny drop time. There is no difference at all between a great home hi-fi speaker and a great monitor. In other words, you can take, as I mentioned before, any of the great classic monitor speakers, even in the JBL period, because you see the blue face things all the time, because all over the place because of listening bar mania. You can take these things and put them in the home and they sound amazing. They're just wonderful. There's things with studio speakers, for example, you can't have a big horn, like I said, because it's too, you You can't have a horn really close to you. So that's why this looks the way it does. But there's no difference. So what Jim is actually saying is he doesn't know why you'd have emotional involvement with any loudspeaker, which is, amazing. So I'm going to tell you actually what he doesn't know. I'm going to give you that in a moment. All right. You have these monitors, which he says all these things are easily achieved. They're only easily achieved through digital signal processing. So if you don't have digital signal processing, making a great monitor is one of the most difficult things possible. And the way monitors are made today is all wrong because they are working in a closed feedback loop with what music is and the way music is delivered. Okay? What do I mean by that? In the golden age of sound production, 50s, 60s, 70s, music was primarily acoustic, and you had only tube amplification, which was low powered, and you didn't have ways to combine, tens, hundreds, or thousands of tracks. Multi-tracking didn't exist. So the whole technology evolved to capture the tiniest nuances in the way somebody was playing an instrument or singing, performing. And it was extremely good at that. It got the time domain right. Got the time domain right because they used big cone speakers with very light cones and horn-loaded high-frequency drivers with tube electronics. So you had high efficiency, right? And you had large source size. As music technology progresses and we have solid-state amplifiers and we have these small, inefficient loudspeakers, we lost the nuances that came with those two aspects of the previous generation's technology. We started to lose the acoustics in sound. Music became more and more manipulated and more electronic. Cut to today, what we have is, in many cases, hardly music at all. We have elevated low frequency and elevated high frequency, and the mid-range, which is where the emotional, affective part of music and sound reside, and where our ears and our brains are most sort of acute, this has been sucked out. So now you have situations. I was just at my friend Joey Weiss's studio up in the Rosendale district, and he's got an amazing analog studio. He's actually using our speakers as monitors. And he's telling me some of these stories of, for example, clients listening to a mix and then saying, can you make this sound good? We want you to optimize this mix for this. Imagine that. Make this sound as good as possible. Mix it for this. Speaker in here is this big. What do you think, that's going to sound like on anything for real? It's going to sound like utter shit. Studio personnel, people in the music industry, take it for granted that you want to make your music sound best on the worst possible devices, which are very limited in frequency. And then, you get rid of the accurate time domain. So you make garbage music for the garbage, cheap plastic devices that everyone's using, and you have a perfect feedback loop of utter shit garbage. And the monitor is like one link in that loop. So if you don't have a great monitor, and I can only think of one other really good monitor made today, which is Gaitan, which is what Niels Fromm, who I'm friendly with, has in his studio in the Funkhaus in Berlin. Niels Fromm actually is a great example of an artist working in electronic music who really knows and cares about sound. That's why he has very good monitors. The problem is that since most music is electronic, it's been dumbed down to basically, music to turn you mechanical. It's very mechanical, and it's meant to turn you into a machine. The other way in which music has gone down the toilet is with music that's meant to basically put you to sleep, sometimes literally. So we've got this situation where a speaker like this, who is this for? It's a really interesting question. It's for anyone who wants to listen. This would be great in listening bars. This would be great for people in studios who want to make music that sounds as good as it possibly can. Not how to continue their career making, sonic garbage, but that sells very, very well and that, ensures an income stream. These things are outside of that world. And I think it's really important that we start to understand what we're doing to our senses. I did a video not so long ago where I took a bag of Doritos, junk food, and crushed it to show what was really in there. Like it's just air and you get a little chemical dust is what that really amounts to. What we're doing to sound is really like what we've done to food. We've killed food production by turning it into agribusiness and junk food. We're fast doing the same to music. These speakers were designed to give at least somebody, I hope you're out there, an honest view into what music and sound should really sound like. Thanks for listening.